I'm Kat McDonald, and this is Rebloom Room, a podcast that explores the many ways that Black and Brown women can bring more joy into our lives. In this episode, you'll meet Natalie Lue. She's a writer, podcaster, and artist who helps people eliminate emotional baggage, break unhealthy relationship habits, and increase their self-esteem so they can create better relationships in love and at work. She gives you straight talk with wisdom, empathy, and humor. Back in the 2010s, I was going through a divorce, and I was finally ready to let go of all kinds of relationship habits that were harming me. Habits like ignoring huge red flags, putting up with unacceptable behavior, and overall pretending that I didn't want what I wanted, which was a loving and supportive life partner who understood and adored me. I didn't want to walk around wearing heavy emotional armor, but I did need to learn some new ways to protect myself emotionally so I could finally be myself in romantic relationships. That's when I started reading, that's when I started devouring Natalie Lue's blog, Baggage Reclaim. Her blog was a beacon in the darkness of my divorcing days. It talked me off the ledge in so many ways. If you find yourself in a relationship or situationship or even a marriage that's hurting your heart, Natalie has gems for you. Welcome, Natalie.
Oh, thank you for having me, Cass.
Yeah. So first of all, let me say how grateful I am to you for creating this blog. Seriously, I love how it's grown in the past decade or so.
Baggage Reclaim's been around for like 16 years.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah. It has.
That's amazing.
It's almost out of its teenage years.
I know. You're like a grand dame of the internet.
Love it.
So tell us about the mission and the origin story of Baggage Reclaim, how it started and how it's evolved.
Well, when I started Baggage Reclaim it was September 2005. So in the sort of month or two before, I had experienced, I guess looking back now, I'd experienced somewhat of an awakening as such that had come about from, I had been blogging on a personal blog at that point for just over a year, and I'd had an immune system disease called sarcoidosis, and I'd had a pretty sort of damning prognosis, basically saying go on steroids or you'll be sort of dead by the age of 40 type of thing. And at the same time, when I'd sort of got that diagnosis as such, I remember thinking, geez, like I've been sick, at that point, I think for about 18 months. And I've been so preoccupied with men. So, I've been seeing a guy, and I say that very loosely, at work at one point who was involved with, he already had a girlfriend, basically. Then I'd finished it with him, walked away from that, even though we worked together as well. And then I'd been seeing somebody else and he was not ready for a relationship. And he said that to me around the same time that I got this diagnosis. And I remember wondering to myself, what is going on with me? Like, why do I keep finding myself in these situations again and again? And I remember being on the phone to him saying, look, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. And I said, what makes you think that I'm the type of person that would put up with a situation like this? And I remember it felt like, I know it sounds almost cliche, but I did feel the world shift a bit, something tilted a little, where suddenly it hit me. I am exactly that woman that would put up with that situation. Like he knew I would because I had.
Yeah.
And I remember coming off that call and suddenly everything looked different. Everything seemed different. And my mind got real busier. And I remember going on my blog and speaking out loud and saying, I seem to have a thing about emotionally unavailable men who tend to still be attached to the umbilical cord and who chase me and then they pull back and, they never want to be in a relationship and I have all these problems and it's all my fault. And I said, and I realized I've got mommy issues, daddy issues, you name it. And people were like, yeah, you're talking about me. And I thought that was strange because I always thought I was a weirdo. Like I thought there was something about me that was unlovable that made people go away, that decide to change their mind from being the person who I thought they were in the beginning. They liked me in the beginning, in my mind. So when they were not available, when they didn't treat me well, I decided, well, it must be because they had seen something about me. And yet all these people were saying, you're describing my life. You're describing my experiences. And I was like, this is interesting. And so when I started Baggage Reclaim, I'd had a lot of people saying to me, I'd love it if you could take some of the insights that you share on your personal blog and just like have like just a whole thing like dedicated to talking about these subjects, because I guess I was talking about them in ways that people were not used to seeing. And I was tired of I'm 44, so I grew up in the time of, Cosmopolitan, More Magazine, Just 17. The overwhelming majority of advice, and in fact, 100% of the advice that we received back in the day about relationships was really centered around 50 ways to please your man. And it was all sex, put on lingerie, try harder, learn this sex position, be nice, be cute, don't make waves, all that type of crap. And I wanted to have a different conversation. And so I started Baggage Reclaim. And my mission, and it still remains the same, was that if I could help at least one person avoid what I had been through, or if I could help somebody get out of the same types of situations that I had been in, I'd felt like I'd given back in some way, because writing a personal blog had allowed me to confront patterns in my life. And this audience is very generous with me. And I loved this idea of paying it forward, I guess. And here I am, 16 and a bit years later, and I've helped a lot more than a couple of people.
Yes, definitely.
But the mission remains the same, because I think that there's a lot of us out there who have abandonment issues, who are recovering people pleasers or just full on people pleasers, perfectionists. A lot of us are over responsible. And we're struggling, and we need help.
Yeah, that whole Cosmo Try Harder campaign, just, that was so destructive. It's so destructive.
Yeah, everything is predicated on this idea, and I think it is so toxic and it is so pervasive in our culture, but everything is predicated on this idea. If you want something, just put a lot of effort into it. If you haven't got it yet, well, it must be because you haven't put in enough effort yet. So everything is try harder, try harder. And we don't learn that discernment about, well, hold on a second, what if the thing that we're trying at isn't the thing that we should be pursuing? Maybe it's not the thing that we even want. Or what if the way that we go about trying harder is destructive? What if the messages that we have learned about trying harder are really abusive and exploitative?
Yeah. What are some of the ways that you see women creating relationships that drain them instead of making them happy?
So I think that going from the trying harder sort of perspective, we often don't necessarily consciously go out of our way to choose our relationships from a healthy place. So instead, on some level, we get activated by the sense of, oh, this is a situation where I have to try. This is a situation where I can be a good girl and prove myself and win. And we then hitch ourselves to these situations that drain us out, because we then perform at being the good girl, the good wife, the good spouse, the good partner, the good daughter, the good employee, the good friend. And it's not that we are not good, but as a society, we are too hung up on that. But what we're doing is we're performing at what we think it means to be that kind of person. So we don't choose from a place of our values and honoring our needs and our boundaries, who we are. Instead, it's like, oh, okay, right, well, I want to be a good girlfriend. I want to be a good mother. I want to be a good whatever. Okay, so I think that means this. And we will pick out some of the most destructive things. I mean, I remember when I became a mother, and I was shocked at the narrative around motherhood and how it then just became this whole sort of keeping up, this constant sort of treadmill. And there's a lot of judgment and criticism. And I was like, wow, I knew somebody she'd spout off all of this stuff about, clean home, exercise, all this stuff. She's chowing down Mars bars. But it's all performing at being, people forcing themselves to breastfeed, even when it's become excruciating, even when they know they need and want to stop, but they push at breastfeeding because they think, oh, well, if I don't do that, then I'm not the image of the good mother. So, and this just crops up throughout our experience as women. I think as well, what's particularly draining for us is that the messages that we have internalized growing up, we hear a lot of be good, be sweet, be meek, be mild, don't make waves, be a good girl, do as you're told, don't be selfish. Oh, that boy that's being mean to you, it's because he likes you.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
We've heard a lot of jacked up stuff. It's don't be slutty. Don't wear that. Don't do that because you'll get us a reputation. Not you. Well, sometimes it was you'll get yourself a reputation, but it was also no, you're going to get us a reputation. So we were oriented
Black women, that we represent all Black women.
Yeah. Oh my gosh! Like I grew up in Dublin in Ireland. So at the time when I was growing up there, sort of late 80s into the 90s, early 2000s, there were not that many Black people, full stop there. And so when you do something, it becomes, that's what every Black person does, or that's speaking for every Black woman. And it's amazing how society sexualizes you as a Black person, as a Black woman.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting that you can do something. And it's funny because I was explaining this to a white friend, and I said, when something happens in the media, for instance, a Black woman has done something, as Black women, as Black people, we're going to wince because that will become, oh my God, all Black people, the comments in people's living rooms.
Yeah.
We'll be like, oh yeah, those Black people, those blah, 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 beep, beep, whatever. And she was like, really? That's what it's, I said, yes, because that's how we're judged.
And even having to explain that to someone is exhausting.
Yeah, like the emotion. Somebody messaged me like a few months ago, basically expressing their opinion about something in the media that they felt they didn't think was right. And I actually turned around and I said, you need to have this conversation with somebody else.
Yeah.
I'm not your person. I said, I have been Black every single moment of my life. So if you want to talk about why you think Black people should or shouldn't do this or blah, 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 you need to talk about that with somebody else.
Yeah.
Not me.
You go read a book or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, when people are posing with those books like last summer, so like that's summer 2020, people who you'd never seen within 500 miles of a Black person suddenly like in their garden with, Black fiction or a book about racism. I was like, oh my gosh.
Okay. Yeah. The performative wokeness.
Yeah. Big time.
So I wanted to talk about boundaries, because you've said that boundaries are basically personal awareness of what you will and won't accept. And as women, we are trained to be open and loving and to serve the people that we love. But it often means that we serve other people's needs to the detriment of our own needs. Can you talk about what a relationship looks like when one or both people don't have healthy boundaries, and what it looks like when people do?
So when we don't have healthy boundaries, we don't know where we end and the other person begins. Like we're very oriented to catering to the other person's needs, desires, expectations, feelings, and opinions. So, and it can be we can be so used to it that it can be almost entirely out of our awareness, that before we say or do something, we've already run the calculation somewhere. Is this going to inconvenience them? Is this going to burden them? Is this going to hurt their feelings? Is this going to offend? Is this going to and it's not even necessarily happening in a conscious way, although sometimes it can be, but we default to putting ourselves out rather than putting the other person out. I think when we don't have healthy boundaries, we don't really have a sense of what our responsibilities are, and we don't have a sense of who we are. And so we tend to be and do what we think the other person needs and wants. So we can be quite the chameleon when we don't have healthy boundaries in our relationships. And so we will say the thing that we think is, amenable. We will go along with things. Or up at the other end of things, when there is difficulty, we will distance ourselves from our personal responsibility, and it'll be like, oh, well, it's the other person. It's their fault. It's their response. So that's how we end up with all the resentment. And you always know that we've got some difficulty around boundaries if we have recurrent feelings of resentment, obligation, guilt, and anxiety. Those I call the people pleaser feelings. And once you keep having these feelings of guilt and obligation and anxiety, you're guaranteed to wind up at resentment. I think as well, when we don't have healthy boundaries in our relationships, a big thing is that consciously or not, we come from a place of almost being in what I call like a child role. So we act as if the person is an authority over us, that they have way more power over us than they do, that this person is basically like our oxygen supply. So then it becomes like this person knows best, or this person is in charge, or I have to default to whatever this person is saying or doing. And when we have this sort of thinking of, for instance, I can't be honest because I'm going to hurt feelings. I can't say no because it's going to hurt feelings. All that type of stuff, that's very childlike thinking. But this is where we learned it in childhood, is to think that we are responsible, for making others feel and act in a particular way. And in our relationships where we don't have healthy boundaries as well, I think that actually we hide a lot of ourselves. When we don't have healthy boundaries, we act like, oh, I'm this generous and loving and giving person, and I just want to be and do all of these things for everybody else. But actually we're hiding. Like that's a mask, like that's a costume. When we're in a healthier relationship, like we actually do know where we end and the other person begins. It's not that we don't struggle to say no at times. It's not that we don't have our moments where we go along with things, because hello, we're all human here. But because we have a sense of self, because we know what our values are, so what our character is, what matters to us, and we know that we want the relationship to be genuinely honest and intimate, we will say the things that it would be all too easy not to, just to avoid the confrontation. And so I find that when we have healthy boundaries in our relationships, we will tend to say and do the things that a lot of other people would avoid to try to not make waves. And so we have more intimate, more honest relationships. I think as well, when we have healthy boundaries as well, we say yes and no authentically. And this is a biggie, because when we don't have healthy boundaries, yes, or maybe, and then, okay, yes. So instead, when we have healthier boundaries, we say yes and no authentically. Because if everybody's going around saying yes, or if somebody's going around saying yes all the time, you're lying. It's as simple as that. Nobody wants to say yes all the time. They don't. And so if you're not saying yes authentically, you're saying it resentfully, fearfully, avoidantly. And that leads to far more problems than if you just said no in the first place. So when you get into that healthier boundaries, you are more discerning with your yes, because you understand the impact, so the meaning and consequences of what you say yes, maybe, and no to. So you understand not just how it might impact on others, but you actually consider yourself in the equation.
Yes, when women don't consider themselves in
this is the thing. Yeah, if people say to me, "Oh, I have great boundaries," and then in the same breath, that same woman will be turning around and saying to me, "Yeah, but I don't have time for myself, and I've always doing all of these things for people," or "No, I just kind of had to put their feelings first about that one." When you have healthy boundaries, you consider yourself in your actions and choices, right? You don't go around just doing stuff and it's all oriented to everybody else. You consider yourself and you understand what that potential impact might be. And you take responsibility for that because, and we all do it. I've had my moments at home, where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired and the house is blah, 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 blah. And then you start to feel resentful. And I'm like, hold on a second. Why are you sitting here hating on the dog and the family, about how untidy the house is? Verbalize, because it's easy to sit there and be like, why aren't people noticing how tired I am? I've actually had to learn to say, I am tired, or I need help with such and such. And these are signs actually of healthy boundaries, when you are able to recognize your limits, where you will not exploit yourself or allow others to exploit you, and where you are willing to recognize where you have and adjust and learn from that.
So if you can take it a step further, what does it look like? And how do you create a close, loving relationship with someone and still maintain our personal boundaries? And that's something like, once your boundaries are in place and you've practiced and you've done that, how do you create that relationship with someone else with healthy boundaries and maintain it?
That's a really, really great question. And I think that we are constantly in flow and evolving. And I always call life is on the job training. So as much as we can, for instance, spend time away from others and work on our relationship with ourselves, the true extent of that work really reveals itself through our relationship. So we need to interact with people to really shape up our boundaries and to understand sort of where we need to adjust in certain places. And I think that it's interesting when we first have a sense of, oh God, I've had some boundary issues, there can be a defensiveness in our relationship. So we're on guard. We want to make sure nobody's screwing us over. So I say to people, if the words that are coming out of your mouth include the word boundaries in the sentence, you're probably not being boundaried. So I say to people, if you're saying to them, my boundaries are this, and you're like, man, you can't, no, because actually our boundaries are communicated through how we interact with people, how we show up, the words, our actions, how we're taking care of ourselves. And the way to get close to people is it's that interdependence where you're able to be independent and also depend on others at the same time. And that's because you have a clear sense of who you are. And it is that recognizing the other person's humanness without them making up a whole story about it. Because a lot of people get carried away, where they think, oh, empathy is, oh, they could be going through such and such. Okay, well, let me adjust myself and change all of my life to suit the story that I've come up with around empathy. And it's like, actually, notice what you're hearing in your head. You start to have this sort of observational mode that allows you to get close to people. So I'll give an example. And it's funny, I was talking with somebody about this a couple of days ago, where they literally are trying to do what you've described, trying to have healthier boundaries, also trying to get close to people. Part of that is noticing where the defensiveness pops up, because where the defensiveness pops up is giving a clue about where you have a pattern of being afraid of intimacy, where you're probably going to try to control something. And then asking that question, why might that be? Or why is this showing up right now? Rather than, and it does happen to us sometimes, and I remember this happening to me in the early months of our relationship, sort of plowing on ahead and then being like, oh gosh, I totally realized that something was coming up there, but I just kind of ignored it. It's like, oh, having that curiosity, why is that defensiveness showing up there? And how can I be a bit more open and less judgmental without losing myself in the process? I think as well, it's about what is it that you need to say to yourself that would allow you to step forward in a more honest, loving, and safe way. So in these situations, like sometimes we're saying stuff in our head, and I notice some of the stuff I say in my head, and I'm like, oh, this is pretty interesting. And then it's like, before I turn around and I'm going to say something to my husband, I check myself and like, well, what is it that I need here? And sometimes actually what it is that I need is I need to be honest about the thing that I'm really scared of. And actually, ultimately, that is how we get closer with people, is learning how to be a bit more and in stages. Don't try, if you're normally, let's say it on a scale of 0 to 10, if normally your honesty levels and your intimacy levels, for argument's sake, let's say it's hovered around a 2, 3 out of 10. Why are you trying to jump from 2 to 10? Like, think about what would somebody, let's say you're a 3. If you want to be a little bit more boundary, what would somebody who is a 4 or a 5 do? Mm-hmm. Edge towards that. Rather than being like, oh, I have to be this, and maybe 10 we think of as perfection, and that doesn't exist. So I say to people, what's the next level up? Mm-hmm. Imagine somebody who's just a little bit more confident about boundaries, who's a little bit more boundary than you. What would they do? What's the edge towards that? And see how you are with that. See how that fits around you. And then gradually move up from there. Because if you try to go from what might be a 1, a 0 straight up to 10, you're going to be triggered.
Mm. You have some very useful terms to talk about the kinds of bad behavior that we might get sucked into putting up with in relationships. One of my favorite terms is future faking. Can you talk about what future faking is and what we need to do when we see it happening to us?
I think most people who come across it, they say the future faking one is their favorite. So future faking is when somebody basically fakes a future to get what they want in the present. So that might be that they outright promise stuff. Oh, I can't wait for us to go to a wedding in 6 months' time. I can't wait for you to meet my parents. Oh, we're going to move in together, blah, blah, blah. That causes something to shift in the present where, for instance, we turn around and we sleep with them. We drop our guard, whatever that might be. Some people, it's intimated, like they're so full on. So they're quite sort of emotionally intense and behaving as if the relationship is further on, that we get sucked into that as well. And it's problematic because we buy into this. The person sells us, the promises, the sun, the moon, the field full of ponies. And then we're like, what happened to that great person that I met in the beginning? And some people future fake intentionally. So they know that if they talk about more dates, going to events, referencing things in a few weeks to a few months' time, that the person is more likely to sleep with them, to drop their guard, to give them money, to let them back in, whatever that might be. There are some people, however, I'd say a lot of people who have future faked to this way, where it's unintentional, but it's nonetheless problematic. It's a boundary issue in that they are loose with their words. Mm-hmm. They are loose with their behavior in the sense that when they meet somebody, even though they know that they have this pattern of going in really intensely and then almost being scared off by their own intensity and backing away, they keep throwing out the words. They keep over-promising and under-delivering. They keep, overestimating their commitment levels. And they are irresponsible with their words because when you're disconnected from yourself, and so you're afraid of feeling your feelings, and you're afraid of being too honest about who you are, of course you're going to turn around and say stuff that's not true. And then you sell people on this idea of a future, and then it's like, oh, well, I changed my mind. Or you start gaslighting the person and making it like, I don't remember saying that.
Yeah. It's interesting. We, in the United States, lived a good 5+ years under a narcissist in a particular resident of the White House. And all of these terms started coming into the public, people who had not had a narcissist in their life before started understanding what is gaslighting, started understanding the sort of patterns of narcissist behavior, the love bombing and the triangulating and all of that. Have you seen a connection between that? Like with people saying, oh my gosh, this reminds me of my relationship. Like, have you seen people making those connections?
Yeah, totally. I think that that 5 or so year period, which to be fair it's still rumbling on in some respects, but I think it was very triggering for a lot of people because it's like having the manifestation, like the physical manifestation of some of the most toxic behaviors that you might have encountered from an abusive partner or from abusive parents, actually. Something actually I found quite fascinating. And I think I remember talking about this with somebody in 2016, and I remember them sort of being a bit shocked by sort of what I had said. I was at some event and they were like people sort of in the media. And I said, I think that some of the people who were sort of enthralled by this person, drawn in, it was like they were under the spell of the original narcissist or sociopath in their life. And they saw this sort of unequivocal loyalty, just being completely blind devotion. They saw it was almost like, look, daddy, look, mommy, like, I love you. I'm going to prove myself to you. They doesn't give two hoots about any of them, but they were totally sucked into that. And it was interesting. Like, I think that what that period did is, I mean, we have never talked about gaslighting as much as we have in the last, between reality TV and that 5-year period of what was going on in the big house. We as a society have had to reckon with that realization that we have a serious problem with gaslighting. And it's, I liken it to, and it's funny because I've seen this crop up in my work so many times, but I have long felt that it's like we're in, do you remember that Hans Christian Andersen tale, The Emperor Has No Clothes On?
Yeah, for sure.
The guy's naked. And oh, look at his beautiful clothes, blah, 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 blah. We are living that.
Yeah.
And it's like nobody wants, or certain people don't want to turn around and say, hey, the person is naked. And if you turn around and say the person is naked, and oh my God, you terrible person, cancel, blah, blah, blah. It's like, what? This is the world we live in.
Yeah. It's uncanny. It's really uncanny. Can you talk about no contact? What is no contact and how does it work?
So no contact is really a process that you would go into after a breakup. So it's not a means of breaking up. It is something that can follow after a breakup when it becomes quite clear that just like breaking up or distancing, because sometimes it might not be a romantic partner. It could be, for instance, from a family member or a friend, but it becomes quite clear that the boundaries are pretty blurred. And so stopping contact, whether it is temporarily or in some instances permanently, is a way of inserting boundaries into the situation and recovering your self-esteem. Because, you know, back in the day when you broke, you're broke, right? So if you decided that you wanted to end your relationship or, you know, that you wanted to take some distance from somebody, there was a telephone, there was, you got to turn up at your house, or you had to write a letter. Now there are a multitude of ways that that person or you can have a window into each other's lives. There are a multitude of ways that you can still actually be connected and attempting to communicate. And we are not designed for this. And we are so obsessed with our image that what can happen is we realize that the situation is not healthy, and we actually still try to remain in contact with this person while also juggling our painful feelings about the breakup or our painful feelings about the mistreatment. And at some point we have to make a choice and be like, actually, I have to go no contact so that I stop engaging and I finally start taking care of myself and processing whatever has happened so that I can grieve that and start to move forward.
Why do people keep wanting to stay in contact with people who are causing them pain?
A lot of people are afraid of losing. So our ego gets in the way. Our ego is concerned with winning, being right, and who has the power. So what can happen is that the ego, it feels wounded, and it's like, oh my gosh, if I stay connected to this person, I might actually win. I might get to prove that they are in the wrong, or I get to prove that I'm who that they should be with. So we can get stuck on that. I also think as well that breakups are a form of loss, and loss brings up other loss. When we try to stay in contact with somebody, even though it really goes against our sort of sense of health, our boundaries, our health, we are trying to avoid grieving the loss of whatever has happened and coming to terms with that so that we can now proceed forward on a healthier ground. And what happens is we go through that experience and it brings up all the other losses, maybe that we haven't even dealt with, the unprocessed grief, the ungrieved grief. And so it's like, if I avoid that, then I don't have to confront my feelings about those other breakups I didn't deal with, or my feelings about my father or my mother or my whatever it is that are coming up. You know, loss is loss. So it brings up all of that old loss. I also think as well that, you know, a lot of people pride themselves on being the type of person who exes want to stay friends with or who want to stay in contact with. So on one hand, we feel tortured, but on the other hand, if we weren't in contact or they stopped making an attempt, we would feel upset that they are not even trying to pursue us anymore. So we stay in the situation, even though we are prolonging our agony. Again, you know, that's an element of the ego as well. I think as well, we're still in some respects, even though social media and texts and all that have been around for quite some time now, I think that we're actually still quite in the infancy of understanding the psychological warfare of remaining in contact in these ways. It's like we're trying to have it all ways. We're in pain, but we don't want to have to make the difficult decision. A lot of people see no longer being in contact as I'm attacking that person, I'm hurting their feelings, I am rejecting them, I am being a mean person, like I should be above having to distance myself. If I were a better type of person, so it's the try harder thing, you know, all over again. So they will hold themselves in there. And sometimes we're auditioning. It's like, I'm going to stay in contact with this person and I'm basically going to audition for my old role. And at some point, they're going to realize, oh my gosh, look at this. I treated them so badly and they have stayed there all this time. Do you know what? I'm going to reward them with a happy ending. We're going to ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after.
That old story.
Yeah, that old story.
You've said, and I quote, you can't work your way up from booty call to girlfriend. Can you explain that? Because I know someone out there needs to hear this.
I can't even remember when I wrote this, a long time ago, but I said, you know, if you start out booty, you stay booty. Like a booty call and a relationship are not the same thing. And think of a booty call as, you know, when you get those credit cards and you get the low introductory APR offer where you don't have to, you know, you get all these extra bits and you don't have to pay any interest on your purchases for the first year or whatever. Booty calls are like us doing our low introductory APR offer and hoping that somewhere along the way in this booty call situation where we are essentially exploiting ourselves so that this person can gratify themselves in whatever way, we're hoping that that person will go, oh, do you know what? We should be in a relationship at some point. Now, I get it. People have needs. Specifically, people have sexual needs. But the thing is that if you can't be casual about a casual relationship, then it's not casual. And most humans cannot handle being treated casually. And so when you are in a booty call situation, that person is not engaging with you in the same way as it would be if the two of you were interacting through the process of potentially exploring the possibility of starting a relationship. You started off on a footing where even if it's not your intention, you've ended up kind of laying yourself out, accepting crumbs, laying yourself out literally, accepting crumbs. And now you've got to try to work your way back from that. And I get a lot of people say to me over the years, oh, I know this person, they were in a booty call and like they then know, even though like he or she treated her really, really badly, like they then like got married a few years later, like when she got pregnant, like they married her.
Yikes.
That's what you're aspiring to. So I know it's hard to hear because I think what a lot of people do is we are afraid of intimacy and we are afraid of getting hurt. So, well, you know what? I can get sex and I can spend time around this person. Then we say, oh, I caught feelings. No, you had feelings, but you pretended you didn't. You accept the booty call. And booty calls work if it's short term. Booty calls do not work once it is really going beyond the short term, because then you're just calling it a booty call when actually what you really want is a relationship.
Yep. You have to be honest with yourself.
Absolutely. I think one of the big things around booty calls is that it gets pitched as being something mutual. And I think when it's short term and each person is genuinely honest and is able to be emotionally responsible, then it can be that. But often what happens is it's one person advancing their self-interests at the expense of the other and calling it mutual. Mm-hmm. Oh, we're both enjoying this. It's both of, no. And then you're sitting there gnawing your nails, wondering when you're going to get the next text and if something's going to happen and who they're with. Clearly, this is not a booty call.
So you've written a series of scripts that women can use when they need to say no, but don't know how. So basically you're teaching women to stand up for themselves in relationships. Why do women need coaching on how to say no? What's that all about?
Well, we are socialized to avoid saying no. I liken it to, or I describe it as, we grew up in the age of obedience, where the interacting with, the parenting, of children, the communicating with children, really centered on making children obedient and making them making them compliant, so excessively agreeable. And as a result, we've lost our no along the way. And particularly as women, where we're socialized into patriarchy. And then we got all the other stuff that comes along with that. We've got ageism, sexism, racism, ableism, fat phobia, the list goes on. Mm. And we struggle to say no because we're stuck in the good girl mode and wanting to please others, but also wanting to keep ourselves safe. So we see saying no as a way of endangering ourselves. Mm. And it is amazing that people tend to associate saying no with literally going, somebody asks something and you go, no. And okay, yes, you could just say no on its own. But as I point out and show through these scripts, there's like 450 different ways to say no. And it's really, I created that to show people, actually, there are so many ways that you can say no. And of course, we can always communicate no as well through our actions. But there are so many ways for us to say no without shaming ourselves, without over-apologizing. Like, I think that if I use the word sorry, I'd say it's probably in like 1 or 2 scripts out of the 450. Because we over-apologize as women, we overthink it, and we try to couch it, and we make it all fluffy. And it's really about teaching us how to communicate more clearly so that we can own ourselves and take care of us. It's realizing that we can actually use no as a way to heal ourselves and also to bring and do and be and have the things that we truly need and want into our lives as well.
So say someone has a goal of co-creating a relationship that's mutually fulfilling, that consists of love, care, trust, and respect. Maybe though, if you've never seen one of those up close, where can we go to find examples of this kind of relationship? And how do we begin to imagine one of these so that we can co-create one for ourselves?
This is a great question. We're all living in a world where we didn't grow up with great examples of relationships. What we saw on TV or in films is very unrealistic, dodgy,
warped,
yeah, homogenous in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying that all relationships are terrible back in the day, because I'm sure that we can think of people, but we can, of course, look to within our social circle or the people around us. But I also think that we sometimes have to be careful of romanticizing other people's, oh God, they seem so loving, they seem so perfect. And this was something that I found that myself and so many people struggled with. And so there's a few things that I did. So I talked about the 4 qualities of a loving partner, because this stops you from getting sidetracked by, oh, they said we're going to go on holiday. We went to IKEA. I met their friends. They bought me this. They bought me that. They said this. They said that. So I talk about the 4 qualities, which are being emotionally available, having a positive outlook. And what I mean by that is you do not have to be positive all the time, because that is not realistic. I am not positive all the time. Neither are you. However, if you're in a relationship with somebody and they don't see a future and they're very, very negative about relationships, that is not going to bode well for the two of you. Even if they talk about it in this sort of, oh, it's other people, oh, relationships suck. That's telling you something about how they perceive relationships. So you need somebody who's willing to see a future with you, who's willing to see that actually relationships are not a monolith and that there are healthy relationships and that it is possible to create a healthy relationship within the one that you're in. It's also what I call ownership. So integrity, responsibility, and maturity. And that sense of ownership means that the two of you in your relationship are going to take ownership of yourselves as well as this relationship that you are co-creating. And the other one as well is commitment to self. And what I mean by this is, sometimes you meet people and you don't know which version of them you're going to get from one week to the next. Like every time you meet them, you're like, oh, this is who you are now. Like it's a constant. And I'm change, great. Evolution, great. But literally, you don't, like, this person is a different person depending on the relationship. You can't keep up. And so that commitment to self is really about you're willing to stop being ashamed of who you are, or to start no longer being ashamed of who you are. And you are committed to becoming more of who you really are. I've been that girl. I have pretended to be whatever a partner was into, whatever a person liked. I pretended that City of God was my favorite film for 2 years. The truth is, my two favorite films are Ghost and Coming to America. Very, very different films. But I pretended that this film was my favorite. And I did that because I thought that that was a way of fostering a deeper connection, proving that we had so much in common. But actually, all that was doing, and it seemed like this is so harmless. No, it was another way that I was basically not committed to who I am. So that's as I said, it's the ownership, the commitment to self, it's the positive outlook, and the emotional availability. Now, what a lot of people do, because we have so little templates around healthy relationships, we latch onto, oh, well, they said they like animals, and they said that they were vegan, or they said they go to church, or they work as a cop, or they do this, or they do that. And we take those as shorthand for, oh, this is somebody who I could build a long-term relationship with. But this is the legacy of when our parents and grandparents and so forth were growing up. That's what they attach themselves to. Oh, they're a pillar of the community. Oh, they go to church. And we all can think of somebody who's like, oh, they come from such a good family. And that good family has got some messed up stuff going in there. Yeah. Or it's like, oh, they go to church. And that person who goes to church is up to some of the shadiest stuff. I'm not saying anything against some people go to church, but you can't take that as, oh, that's proof that this is my perfect partner. And so compatibility is all about values. Ultimately, if you want to have a healthy relationship, if you want to be happy in that relationship, you need to share core values. That's in terms of your character and the shared direction of the relationship. You do not need to be identical, but you need to share core values, because you can't forge a future with somebody who actually, they have very different values to you in terms of character. Like, you're there trying to be honest, they just want to lie. Where you value loyalty, they don't give two hoots about it. But it's also about, it's all very well meeting somebody and say, oh my gosh, I really admire their character, their courage, and blah, blah, blah. But the person doesn't want the same things as you. Compatibility is that shared values. It's the shared core values in terms of the character and the direction. That means they can look however they look. They can be interested in goodness knows how many things, but ultimately it is the moral fiber of this person and that shared direction. And I think that when we start to have a greater understanding of who we are as a person, it is a lot easier to create co-create a healthy relationship. It's when you don't have a sense of who you are as a person, and then you get into a relationship and you're just constantly, it's like you're a listening device going, oh, so they said that they don't like this and they don't like that. Okay, right. So I just need to make sure that they don't do that. Okay, if I do this, then they should maybe ask me to marry them in about. That's not being who you really are. So pay attention to your values, because that's where you create healthy relationships from. And this takes a lot of the stress out of things, because if you have a good sense of what your values are and you operate from that place, it is easier to recognize people who have similar values. And then it is easier to have healthier boundaries, and it is easier to interact with people. And I want to point out, this is not about being in an echo chamber where you only engage with people who, you share the same views as me, because actually people can have very similar values to you and very different views. That's quite an interesting thing that I've noticed about people. But it's really about recognizing that the whole thing of, and I get it, we want people who look a certain way, which again can sometimes reveal our biases as well. Hello to all the Black women who, get skimmed over on dating sites and apps, and, who we have to constantly see in the media about, Black women are the bottom of the blah, blah, blah. So what? It's baffling. When people say, my type is like blondes, they wouldn't even consider going anywhere near, a Black woman. And it's like, okay, this is pretty interesting. The looks thing, of course, like attraction is something that distinguishes a romantic relationship from a non-romantic one. And clearly we need that. But things like looks and hobbies and really sort of anything that really relates to the look and feel of things, but it's not concrete in terms of the character or direction, they're what I call secondary values. And that is where most people, that is where all people who find themselves in unhealthy relationships, or who find themselves in relationships with people that they like and that they care about, but they're not really compatible, that's what their focus is on, the secondary values. Because as a society, we've been taught that person that looks a certain way, they're a good provider. That person who went to this particular university, who earns this particular amount of money, that's great that they went to that university. It's great that they look a particular way. It's great that they earn that amount of money. But it doesn't tell you anything about your compatibility for a relationship. It doesn't tell you about how they could love and care for and respect you and be trustworthy and trust you. It doesn't.
Yeah. And you really only learn those things over time by watching their actions, yes?
Amen, 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 amen.
Actions and their words match, yes.
What people ideally want is that they would love it if I could say to them, do this, do this, do this, follow this blueprint, and you spat out at the other end and you're in this perfect relationship. Or they would love a crystal ball where you can give it a few rubs and then you look at it and it goes, okay, this relationship is going to last until the year 2099. And they go, okay, great, go ahead. Or, this relationship's only going to last 3 months. Okay, I'm out. So we want to avoid that vulnerability of going through the due diligence, the discernment. And actually, as you perfectly put it, it takes time and experience. You can't skip it. And the more you try to skip it, it's the more problems that you have. There is no substitute for that. And the thing I say to people is, in the early stages of getting to know somebody, you can get a very strong sense of incompatibility, but you only get hints about compatibility. It will take time and experience to truly have a sense of how compatible you are. So if you find yourself in an unhealthy relationship and then you play back your mental tape of those first few hours, days, weeks, you will see in there those red flags, or what I call the code amber and red alerts, pointing you to what you're dealing with now. In fact, the majority of people who I have spoken to, when they tell me their stories, all in the first or second date.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's even in the first email.
Yeah. So many red flags.
Yeah. And they paint it green. And I think what happens is we second guess ourselves, particularly again, and this is, speaking to us as women, we have learned to be disassociated from our feelings and to feel guilty for calling a spade a spade. And so when we interact with somebody and our spidey sense goes off and we feel uncomfortable, we feel guilty for that discomfort. We feel guilty for wanting to go home after a date instead of going back to their place. And I've literally said to people, and this would be relating to, for instance, to men. And I've said, so what if he wants to sleep with you? Like, so what if he's got a hard on? It's okay. He can go home with that hard on. Just because he's got one doesn't mean it's like, oh my gosh, poor him. He's got a hard on. I've caused this. I've now got to make sure I do something. I've got to put it to sleep. I've got to make it go away. But we give ourselves this guilt. We have this sense of like, oh my gosh, I've done something as a woman I've got to pay him back for the dinner. And I've seen this as well with same-sex relationships. And it's been quite fascinating that actually the same stuff that crops up in, heteronormative relationships also crops up in same-sex ones. And I'm constantly having to remind women, you don't have to pay somebody back because, you texted however many times, or you went out on a date, or they got you dinner, or whatever it was. You don't. I had this conversation actually with my mom several months back where she said, you know what? I realized that a number of the relationships I got into, I could easily have not bothered to see them again after like the first or second date. But then I was like, oh, you know what? I'll go on to this dinner and then I'll end it after that. So they have the dinner. Okay, well, I'll just do another dinner and then I'll end it after that. And then, okay, I'll go back this one time to their place and then I'm going to end it after that. And then she says, and then you're married to them.
Whoa. Whoa. Yeah, it's lobster in the boiling pot.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
Wow. So I really appreciate you sharing all of this. This is so very juicy. Is there anything that you want to add that I didn't ask you? Anything that you would love to share?
When we're marketed to as women, it's all about improving ourselves, making ourselves better, making ourselves enough. Men are not marketed to that way. Men, it's all about enhancing their greatness, their existing greatness already. And the thing that I really want to get across is that you do not have to wait for some arbitrary point in the future where you imagine that you're going to be enough or perfect or have it all together or healed or get rid of all your emotional baggage. You can start to live your life more as yourself now and going forward. You can choose to do so at any time, and you can choose to do so with the emotional baggage that you have. And I think that this is important for us to understand because we've grown up with some funny narratives around emotional baggage or just baggage, where we see baggage as having a past or having children or having been divorced or something like that. Every single human has emotional baggage. In fact, we're born with some of it as well. When you think about what we're inheriting, there's a term for it. The epigenetics, I think it is, where they're exploring, what you've inherited in terms of, for instance, trauma and stuff like that. But also, we are constantly accumulating through life. And part of our job in adulthood is living our lives in such a way that we start to shed and continue to shed that emotional baggage that we accumulated earlier in life. And do you know how we do that? By having better boundaries. And we do not have to make the whole boundaries thing a really complicated thing. It's using saying no as a way to heal yourself, because the only reason why you are afraid to say no, the only reason why you are saying yes when maybe you really mean no, the only reason why you're saying yes and then afterwards going, oh, flip, I can't believe that I've got all of this stuff to do, or I'm exhausted or overwhelmed, or the only reason why you're saying yes, and then in your head you're going, I can't believe that mother turned around and asked me to do this, the audacity. Don't they realize that the only reason why you're thinking and feeling and acting and choosing in that way is because of the emotional baggage around no and around boundaries. So every single time that you say no, and you say it authentically, but also every single time that you say yes more authentically, you are releasing yourself from some of that baggage from the past and allowing you to move forward with more love, care, trust, and respect. So don't think like, oh my gosh, it's going to take me years to work on myself. No, literally, you can use no as you go as a way to heal yourself. And that kind of rhymed a bit as well as I was saying that.
Thank you so much. This is so healing and wonderful and useful. I love everything that you're doing. And it's so lovely to hear you sort of synthesize everything that you've been doing and learning over the past decade plus. It's great how you're kind of just sitting with it and you're able to share it. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much, Kat. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to Rebloom Room podcast. You can find links to related resources at rebloomroom.com/podcast. And if you like this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time.